Atheist Nomads episode 325, What the Barr.
The podcast you're about to listen to includes cursing and talking about hoo-haws. Please be advised.
Welcome to another episode of Atheist Nomads. I am Dustin, and I'm going to be alone for the first part here, but Lauren will be joining me later when we get to dusting off the degree. But we decided to try splitting up the recording into news, going for a shorter news segment, and then do that closer to actual release date and move the release date back to provide a little bit more time outside of the weekend to try to work on it. And this is, we're trying it out. We'll see how it works. But Lauren is absolutely exhausted and trying to avoid having a migraine come on. So she has gone to bed, and I'll be recording the news and then getting this episode out. But we have recorded the Dustin Off the Degree a few days ago. I am trying out a different mic. We'd gotten a RE320 for Erin, and since she's no longer on the show, it's been sitting in the cupboard for the most part. We used it on the at Camp Nomad, and I decided I want to see and try it out. I will still be on my old mic, the PR40, for Dustin Off the Degree, and so this will provide a little bit of side-by-side comparison between the two. For most of you, you probably won't notice a difference and won't care, but it's good getting a little bit more real-world comparison for me. And boy, is there a lot of news this week. Holy shit. I mean, what the fuck? We've got, between Syria, Brexit, Catalonia, the world is falling apart all around us. This is just... It's really hard to look at some of these stories and think they really matter in the grand scheme of things. And that is, Brexit is definitely outside of the realm of what we talk about on the podcast. What's going on in Catalonia is pretty much outside of the realm of what we talk about on the podcast. So those aren't worth it. Turkey definitely does have a good crossover. And out of all the news stories right now, it is one of the most mind-boggling. So I'm not going to go into all of the details because there are a ton of them. And as this is a rapidly developing story, what I say may not be all that accurate by the time you listen to this. And I am recording this just a couple hours before it actually goes live on the feed. So last week, Donald Trump talked to Erdogan, the current dictator of Turkey, and the Islamist dictator of Turkey. I want to make sure that's clear. They have an Islamist dictator in what's supposed to be a secular democracy. And he asked Trump to pull U.S. forces out of northern Syria so that Turkey could send a force in to wipe out or to invade and stabilize the Kurds that are in northern Syria. These are Kurds that have been working with U.S. Special Forces for the last 5 years. These are Kurds who had U.S. Special Forces embedded with them. This was an invasion once Turkey got the go-ahead from Trump, where U.S. Special Forces and other Special Operations Forces were having to... Some were getting separated from their escape route. And then once Trump announced the U.S. was pulling out of Syria, the Kurds were left with no choice but to accept the help of the Syrian government they've been fighting for the last 5 years, which was heading up towards them, because they had to choose between genocide and compromising with a fascist government. They picked the fascist Russia-backed government over Turkish genocide. And since then, the Syrian government has moved into the area, is directly engaging with Turkey. Russia has occupied a number of these bases that had been U.S. bases, and U.S. forces are continuing to try to extract themselves from a battleground. In the meantime, ISIS soldiers have escaped from Kurdish-controlled prisons as the Kurds were having to flee to make sure they don't die. So who won in this? Erdogan got a win. Syria got a win. Russia got a win because Russia's been backing Bashir and the Syrian regime. Iran has been backing Syria and Bashir's regime, so Iran wins. More than 1,000 ISIS troops have escaped. So ISIS wins. And who loses in all of this? U.S. allies. And now there's a huge mess with nuclear warheads the U.S. has in Turkey, and whether or not those need to be pulled out of the country and how they can do that in such a way that doesn't mean the end of the U.S.-Turkish alliance, which is a part of the NATO alliance. Trump has handed to Vladimir Putin everything he wanted here, and Putin didn't have to do a goddamn thing. Whether you look at it from a diplomatic standpoint, from a safety of U.S. soldiers standpoint, a basic humanitarian standpoint, this was all wrong. Absolutely wrong. Fuck you, Donald Trump. All right, so we're going to go ahead and leave that one. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has just wrapped up its annual conference. This is where delegates from much smaller than the every 5-year general conference, delegates get sent from around the world to headquarters outside of Washington, D.C., and they meet with General Conference Executive Committee leadership, vote on policy recommendations, and various other things. On the docket included further work on how to try to get those pesky West Coast churches that are ordaining women to comply with church doctrine, and abortion. Now, I've said on the podcast quite a few times that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is officially pro-choice. That is probably no longer true. And I say probably because they published the initial draft. They then published a revised draft. The final draft that was approved with only 3 votes against it was only shown on the screen. Even the members of the committee present weren't given copies, and no media that was present were given copies. So if you weren't there and able to keep up with it as they were going through it on the screen, you don't know what was actually passed. What is pretty obvious, especially since there was a motion from a delegate from the Middle East and North Africa Union asking for a rape exemption to be put in place. That was rejected. And looking at the draft, the last draft that is available on the Spectrum website with the link in the show notes, that draft looks like the official policy is that abortion is murder, that abortion is bad, that the church should not judge women who do get abortions, and that they don't have an opinion on what happens if it's actually a medically necessary abortion. When rape was brought up, the response from the leaders was that, oh, well, violence is not a good response to violence. Rape is a violent act. Abortion is a violent act. So one violence to respond to another violence is not a good biblical response. And they were also saying that reality shouldn't have any bearing on biblical interpretation, which is just absurd, especially considering they left it wide open for getting abortions when it's medically necessary, like if the fetus isn't viable or if the health and welfare of the mother is at jeopardy. Yeah, then go ahead and do it. Obviously, that's fine. Nothing in the Bible says that's fine. There's also nothing in the Bible that really says that abortion is wrong. This just goes along with the way the right wing has slowly, with the establishment of the religious right, they picked abortion as a topic that they were going to make a conservative issue, even though it had up to that point only been a Catholic issue. This helped bring Catholics into the conservative Christian political wing. Adventists have been very late joining that, but they have definitely been moving quick in recent years. And honestly, I'm surprised it's taken this long. Now, on the one hand, a conservative, damn near fundamentalist church deciding that abortion is wrong, big whoop. That's barely news. Except for when you consider the fact that the Adventist Church has more hospitals than any other religion other than Catholics. And if you've got the largest owner of religiously owned hospitals being fully against abortion, and the second largest being mostly against abortion, that's scary. That is downright scary. I am glad that they did leave medically indicated situations as identified them as being difficult and purely up to the family and, those closest to the situation. In other words, the actual pregnant woman, up to them to make the decision, as it should be. The fact that they did this as secretive as they did, not publishing the final draft, is bad form. I'm pretty sure in terms of Robert's Rules of Order, that's really bad. I'm a little rusty on Robert's Rules, but that's bad. This is bullshit. They know it. We all know it. This isn't even really news, but it's news. The Mormon Church is begging Utah not to ban conversion therapy for minors. The American Pediatric Association and the American Medical Association are both asking states to prohibit psychologists taking part in gay conversion therapy for gay minors. Utah's governor has called for it to be prohibited, and the change is actually just a licensing rule. The church is framing their objection as being that it's kind of ambiguous. Well, to read the quote, the church is concerned that the proposed professional licensing rule is ambiguous in key areas and overreaches in others. For example, it fails to protect individual religious beliefs and does not account for important realities of gender identity in the development of children. Professional bodies are the ones that should be determining what's professional practice. And those professional bodies, when the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Pediatric Association are all saying it is very inappropriate for professional counselors and psychiatrists to be involved in gay conversion therapy, then it's definitely inappropriate for professional counselors and therapists and psychiatrists to be involved in gay conversion therapy. That's not ambiguous. That's not an overreach. That is professional guidelines for licensed professionals. That's why licensing exists. Yeah, the church wants this to be a thing that can happen. Hey, if this rule doesn't apply to Mormon bishops, Mormon bishops can try to make gay kids not gay, but it's not going to change anything because it doesn't work. It doesn't work when it's done by a competent professional because it's not a thing you can just change. This is another case where a church is trying to push. They want their beliefs and what they've determined to be the appropriate biblical way of looking at things, regardless of what reality is. That's what religion does. And God, it's frustrating. But it's even worse when the government does it. U.S. Attorney General Bob Barr spoke to Notre Dame Law School, warning the students about, quote, the growing ascendancy of secularism, blaming it for violence, depression, mental illness, the ongoing drug epidemic, wreckage of the family. So, when you look at the actual statistics, secularism isn't to blame for any of these things. Violence, for one, is actually down. It has been trending down as the country has gotten less religious, not because losing religion necessarily makes people less violent, but because the world is just generally getting better. Depression rates are higher, but that could just be due to better access and better awareness. Mental illness rates are what they are, probably also increasing, and also correlate with religion. More religious people are more likely to have depression and mental illness. The drug epidemic, while secularism suggests there isn't any moral imperative saying don't do drugs, there's also no connection with whether or not somebody's religious as to whether or not they're going to be addicted to heroin. Because the opium epidemic, which is the really serious one right now, in a lot of cases has started with legitimately prescribed pain medications, and whether or not somebody's in pain has nothing to do with how religious they are. And the wreckage of the family, that's just complete bullshit. I don't even know what he's talking about there. Divorce rates are down. People are having children later, which is good for everyone. He's complaining about stuff that aren't actually problems and not related to anything in reality. And he's the Attorney General of the United States. But at least that's something that he was saying at a religious institution, unlike Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who gave a speech on being a Christian leader at the American Association of Christian Counselors World Conference, and then posted it at the top of the homepage for the United States Department of State. Yeah. As of recording, it's dropped off the homepage, but for a few days it was. And this Newsweek article that's linked to in the show notes does show it, and I did see it myself a couple days ago. It is a flat-out constitutional violation for... Yeah, it's fine for him to say those things at a conference about those things. We would still give him shit for it, but to then post it onto the main homepage of the U.S. Department of State... We're talking about the state.gov website is horribly inappropriate. It is unconstitutional. That is a government endorsement of religion with definite favoring of Christianity. It's inappropriate. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. And it's what the Trump administration does all the fucking time. Beto O'Rourke is running for president. And he has now said that he thinks that churches that are against gay marriage should lose their tax benefits. That's their tax-exempt status. On our Facebook page, the general consensus seemed to be that he was going too soft on religion and that all tax-exempt status should be taken away from religion. That would at least be more consistent. The position that he's taking is determining... tying theological views to tax incentives. And that's icky. Actually, I'm going to go further than that. That's not icky. That's just wrong. You can't do that. If you want churches to be more accepting of same-sex marriage, fine. Ask churches to be more accepting of same-sex marriage. But you can't force them through taxes. And that's not helpful to be asking for something like that. Would be much better would be to go for a general making religious not-for-profit organizations equal to non-religious non-for-profit organizations, where they have to do all the same filings, and taking away the special parish tax benefits that pastors get. Take that away, make churches open up their books. Yeah, treat everybody the same. That would be a much better way of doing things. That's not what he's calling for. He's calling for something that is very different and very wrong, and something that I don't think we should be backing him on. And for some good news, California has decided they're going to ban private prisons and immigration detention centers. This is going to require California to probably really revamp this is probably going to require California to cut down on its prison population, which would probably be a good thing. But to get rid of private prisons within 8 years, they're also, I'm sure, going to have to build more prisons. These private prisons have been in use in California for 3 decades. And at its worst, there were twice as many inmates as the prisons could handle, the state-run prisons, so that in it being necessity. So this is going to require the state to either figure out how to build more prisons to keep up with it, or try to figure out ways of cutting down on how many inmates are in prisons. Regardless of that, this is a step in the right direction, because allowing people to profit off of people being locked up opens up way too many opportunities for abuses of prisoners who do not have the same rights as everybody else, and creates incentives for potentially corrupt pressuring of, and I say potentially corrupt in terms of the technical term corruption, not the realistic meaning of corruption. Because like in Idaho, it is totally corrupt, where the state has had to take over some of the privately run prisons because of how horrible the abuses were. And the state has double the incarceration rate that it should for the crime rate, which suggests something is incredibly bad going on, encouraging way harsher prison sentences and higher conviction rates than there should be. And that may be because of corruption, but Idaho's a state that has no way of looking for it, so we don't know. California is trying to get away from that by eliminating a profit incentive for putting people in prison. And that's a good thing. And for our last little bit of good news, the Archdiocese of Seattle has ended religious vaccine exemptions in all 73 Catholic schools in the state of Washington. This will affect 22,000 students, and it will only allow medical exemptions. All other students will have to be fully vaccinated, or at least catching up. Not sure the exact spit on it, but they will have to be vaccinated to get to continue to attend those schools. They are saying that fewer than 2% of all students currently have non-medical exemptions, but they're standing up for vaccines, that's good. They're going to allow till the end of the academic year to get vaccinated. And they will accept medical exemptions, but this is going to help as states are, a lot of states aren't, as they're tightening up the rules on vaccines, a lot of states are keeping it to only applying to public schools and not applying that to private schools as well. And so this is a great way, and if this trend continues across other Catholic dioceses around the country, this will have the benefit of helping plug a major hole that can be created when states only try to tighten the rules for state-run schools. If private schools follow suit and follow, that can help plug those holes, even if the states don't want to plug those holes themselves. All right, so after a quick break, Lauren will be joining me, and we'll be going through dusting off the degree. All right, so for dusting off the degree, I'm going to be doing a series here in the next several episodes on the largest religious organizations you probably haven't really heard of, or that we at least haven't talked about much. This is one of those that I think will be a lot of fun.
This is always fun when you see a survey of the biggest religions in the world, and you're like, wait, what is that? Oh, what is that? That ain't Christian.
And so, but before we get to that, I think it's important to kind of do a little high-level look at the major world religions and how they're all connected. Because they're a lot more connected than most people would assume. For example, I've got a family tree drawn up that you'll be able to find at atheistnomads.com/325. If it's not in the show notes on your podcast app, that if you went from left to right, you can find family connections tracing Shintoism to Christianity. That's weird, but it ultimately all makes sense.
Evolutionarily speaking.
Yeah, evolutionarily speaking, with groups splitting and rejoining, that happens. And so everything all starts off at the top with prehistory and pagan roots. Prehistory, we don't really know a lot about what was happening then. There's what you can find from archaeology, and archaeologists have a horrible tendency of assuming if they can't explain it, it must be cultic.
Yeah, there's a lot of paganistic, cultic reverence that because they found a piece of pottery.
Right. There's an amazing book, humorous book on what would happen if an archaeologist found a modern American bathroom.
No. Yeah.
And it was the family shrine with the toilet seat was the headdress and the toilet was the altar, and
yeah,
you had the wash basin for the ceremonial cleansing before presenting your offerings at it's pretty amazing.
And hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
Quite cheeky, if you can say. Butt cheeks.
So when you don't have written records, or you have very limited written records, it is very difficult to figure out what was going on before that and what connections there were.
Right. So before written language, we basically have some burial sites, some
couple
pottery, couple shrines. Yeah.
So for the most part, we could likely assume, because of some religious terminology that is common across Indo-European languages, that everyone from the Celts in Ireland to Persians to the Indians of the Indus River Valley all share a common religious ancestor, because there are a lot of common... There's cognate terms, and so there's a chance that there was a common Proto-Indo-European religion, if you would even call it that. Granted, at the time you're back to Proto-Indo-European, we're well into prehistory. You don't even have civilizations. You just have cultures. And as a general rule of thumb, cultures, if you don't have writing, it's a culture. If you do have writing, it's a civilization. And cultures do not have religion. They have their little fertility cults.
Anything that can be passed down orally, which isn't very much.
Mm-hmm. And if you were to trace that even further back, there are likely some similarities that would go even further back. Now, there is definitely a chance that there were multiple different points in time throughout history that became what would become religions, or not through in history, in prehistory, but we don't know. There is no way of knowing. And if you're trying to go back 50, 60,000 years, the amount of evolution that has happened in the ideas, in the meme that is religion, has been so drastic that, yeah, good luck finding the connections.
Yeah, except for the little statue of a fat little woman.
Yeah. Oh, man, we dug up so many of those in Jordan.
I can't believe you didn't keep one.
They were so common, they were garbage.
I know, and it's too bad you didn't keep one.
Yeah. Especially since that would have been 2,500 years old.
Yeah. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, well. All
right, so in this chart that I've drawn up, and the way most people look at it, if it's not currently in practice, it's not named. There are a couple of exceptions where it had good enough written records that it gets named. And in my chart, there's only one that is extinct that I went ahead and named. And
which one was that?
That's Platonism.
Ooh.
The philosophical framework that Plato himself created and that then evolved after him.
And then died.
And then got absorbed into Christianity.
Yeah, okay.
It didn't die. It just merged in with something else, ultimately. So I went ahead and kept that one. But for the most part, the lines that I have drawn out coming out of prehistory would have just been early pagan fertility cults. They would probably all have very similar things with animal sacrifices and multiple deities that you're concerned with, and which one you're going to be favoring would depend on the exact circumstances of what's going on. Like you might be favoring a more of an agricultural deity at the planting and harvest time, but when you're fighting your war while the crops are just growing, you're then going to be maybe favoring the war god. And so, but there's a lot of common similarities across all of them, and it doesn't matter if you're... Now, okay, the one exception on that would be if you get over to Japan, where Japan and China was a lot more ancestor worship than gods. More in the middle, the Southwest Asia on over into Europe, it was a lot more of gods who controlled an element of life or the universe.
Okay.
And
cosmic, dude.
But eventually people start writing it down, people start developing theology, and people start philosophizing as to what's going on. And the oldest currently still being practiced is Hinduism, which dates back to sometime in the second millennium BCE. We're talking at least 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago. It is incredibly old.
I'm sure it's pretty different.
Yes, but the Vedic tradition has been maintained quite a bit. It was written down very early. Granted, it had been around for quite a while as a oral tradition until it got written down, probably 1,000 years later. But the Vedic traditions, there's pretty decent records suggesting that it was at least 1,000 years old by the time they really started writing it down, which is just insane. Super, super, super old, where the pantheon has continued. Hinduism has somewhere in the ballpark of 2 million gods.
Yeah. A god for every tribe, a god for every event, a god for every potential event.
Yeah.
Is it one of those kinds of...
If you need something, there is a god you can pray to help you with it.
Sweet.
Kind of like the Catholic saints. So then the next innovation we get isn't even a new innovation. It is a reform on Hinduism, where there were people who started to reject the Vedic tradition and reject the scriptures of Hinduism.
Okay.
And they were shunned.
Shun the non-believer!
And
shun...
became the Jains.
The Jains.
Yes.
Janes?
Jain.
Okay.
And Jainism is actually the religion that Hemant Mehta from Friendly Atheist grew up in.
Oh. It
is one of the smallest religions that's not considered a tribal religion in India. And Jains are you can imagine almost any religion. If somebody gets too fanatical, it's dangerous. The most fanatical Jain would probably commit suicide before actually harming anyone. These are the people who strain their water to make sure they don't swallow a bug. They sweep the ground in front of them while they walk to make sure they won't step on any bug, because they believe all life is so interconnected and karma rules everything so heavily that you must protect everything.
Wow.
And they take do not kill to not just the most logical extreme, they take it beyond the most logical extreme.
He grew up that way?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Next, we're going to have to move from the Indus River Valley in what is modern-day India to ancient Persia, modern-day Iran. And we have Zoroastrianism form around the 7th century BCE. So Jainism was around the 8th century BCE. Zoroastrianism was about 100 years later, where Zoroaster, or what's been ascribed to a theoretical person who would be Zoroaster, when you're dealing with historical figures that far back, it is very difficult to actually prove that person was actually a person and not just a legendary figure. But
right.
Zoroastrianism has the concept of, you have Ashura Mazda, who is the good god, and then you have the bad god. And you have these two dueling deities that govern whether or the balance of life. They also believe in the 4 elements, fire, earth, water, and air. And
or as I like to call it, warm, bubbly mud. That's only if you combine them. Never mind.
They don't combine them. And they take that so seriously that they also believe that burying or burning a body would defile that element. So when a Zoroastrian dies, they put the body on the top of the minaret, their big towers they have, and let the vultures pick the meat off the bones. That doesn't work in the modern day because there are skyscrapers all around India where almost all Zoroastrians are now, and you don't want people looking down at corpses that are being picked apart by vultures.
Yeah.
So they have figured out a loophole to not burn bodies, but to cremate them through electric charges.
Nice.
Yep. Modern technology for the loophole.
Plasma gun.
Not going that far. That would probably pollute air.
So is letting the corpse rot in the sun.
The vultures would eat it.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah. And by keeping it into the I guess within the circle of life, it didn't pollute.
You could just feed the bodies to tigers. that you keep in a pit.
That could have also worked.
That's awesome. I like that idea.
But so what makes Zoroastrianism special is it's the first religion that you could remotely consider monotheistic. It's not a large pantheon. It's not gods governing over certain elements or aspects of life. It is you've got the one good god, the one bad god. Some people consider it polytheistic. Some call it dualistic. It's a lot closer to Platonic dualism than it is to polytheism, but it's not true monotheism. But by that logic, there isn't really any pure monotheism anyway.
Yeah.
Next up, we have the 6th century BCE with 2 separate religions popping up. In the Indus River Valley, you get Buddhism. It starts out as a reform movement, starting again with rejecting the Vedic traditions of Hinduism, wanting a more pure, correct life, not believing the Jains were doing it right, focusing instead
You're like, no, that's too hard.
The Jains focused on nonviolence as the way to do it right, and Buddhism focuses on meditation as the way to do it right.
Okay.
Whereas Hinduism at that time was focused on pleasing the gods as the way to do it right.
Okay.
And so Buddhism's, and all of them have the main goal of becoming one with the universe, and figured out different ways of trying to do what they thought would do that. So yeah, Buddhism around 6th century BCE. That's the same time that Judaism really started.
Oh, cool.
Now, if you ask a conservative Christian about when Judaism started, you would probably get an answer either of around 1000 BC, 1500 BC, or at the Garden of Eden. That's all bullshit.
Well, obviously.
What you had before that was your standard fertility cults and war gods, and the people who would be identified as the Jews later on started worshiping one god over the others, most likely the war god, as they started to fight wars with everyone. And as we talked about last year on a previous Dustin Off the Degree, there was some contention about after they picked on just the one god, there wasn't full agreement that they'd picked the right one, because there were some who continued to worship the fertility goddess,
Who's awesome,
the Queen of Heaven, and viewed their misfortunes as having abandoned her, and that's why their lives sucked, not the war god being jealous and punishing them with the sword. And when you have a religion that starts off with picking the war god, the histories get written from a very violent angle.
The winner writes history, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, this wasn't... So around the time this was starting to solidify would have been the time of the Babylonian exile, when they came into contact with Zoroastrianism and adopted a lot of Zoroastrianism theology. That's where the figure of Satan comes from. They identified God as obviously their God. Yahweh is pure and good and only good. He is the all good one.
This is not the war god.
This is the war god.
The war god is all good.
The war god is no longer just the war god. He is now the only god.
Okay. We've evolved.
And he's all good.
Okay.
Just like Ashura Mazda. And then you've got the other guy, the adversary, the Satan. And that's where the devil comes in. Prior to the Babylonian exile, and in texts that have any plausibility of having been written prior to that, God does good and evil. And in texts that were most definitely written after the exile, God does good and Satan does evil.
And at what time period was this?
6th century BCE.
Okay.
So basically modern Judaism, what you could consider to be truly Judaism, started in Babylon during the exile.
Okay. During the exile of what?
The Babylonian exile, where the Babylonian Empire came in and conquered them and deported all of basically anybody even remotely connected to the royal court, shipped them, and all the priests, and shipped them over to the capital and moved other people into that area.
Okay.
Babylon was one of the earliest empires to shuffle people around. And they took all the best and brightest of every kingdom that they conquered. And so all of the royal court, all the priests, and moved them to the capital.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cream of the crop. Okay. Sorry, I just needed a clarification on that.
Okay, so that's 6th century BCE. That is really what a lot of scholars refer to as Second Temple Judaism. That is the Judaism of the exile and the rebuilding of the temple, and that which continues on until the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, where modern rabbinic Judaism began. So Second Temple Judaism is what we're talking about here.
Okay, but they had a good, 400 something? No, 600.
Yeah, 500 years with the temple,
500
roughly.
years? Okay.
Yeah. So I put Platonism on the chart as kind of an honorable mention. That's about 4th century BCE. This is kind of a rejection of the traditional Greek gods, which were basically just like any of the other pantheon, like traditional pantheons of gods, where you've got a god for everything.
Yeah.
A god for horses, and a god for the sea, and a god for war, and a god for wisdom, and a god for thunder and lightning, and you name it, there's a god for it.
Thunder und Blitzen.
And Plato created this concept of the pure ideal and then the earthly kind of reality. But that the true reality was this theoretical ideal. And his philosophy, after his death, started to look more and more like a religion, especially by the time it got into Neoplatonism a couple hundred years later, where you have these deities of wisdom and language, and sometimes bring in various gods of different groups, and they would draw genealogies of the gods.
Because there are people who are philosophers by trade, and they needed something to do.
Yeah. That, when it combined with Christianity later on, became Gnosticism, and then when it merged in with Christianity, it greatly affected Christianity, which is next. 1st century CE, Christianity starts. It descends theoretically from Judaism. It definitely descends a lot from Platonism as well, and Neoplatonism by that time, which we talked about a few months back as well. If I was more prepared, I would have the episode numbers for these. But at that point, yeah, you're combining these two in, and like Platonism combining into Christianity, it happened several times. You had that kind of initial taking some Jewy stuff with some Greeky stuff, and you mix it together to try to create a Eastern Mediterranean salad of religion. And that's kind of what Paul and the later early church fathers did. And then that already a combination of kind of that Hellenistic Platonism with Judaism mixed again with Neoplatonism to create Gnosticism. And when it got persecuted, they were trying to destroy it, but a lot of it just got merged right back in. And that's how you end up getting kind of that early medieval Christianity. Was a lot of it had to do with bringing in a lot of the ideas from Neoplatonism, that dualistic worldview, that having a separate, immaterial, and immutable soul that is separate from your physical body. The concept of eternal hellfire does not make sense without Platonic philosophy.
Oh, okay.
There is no way to get that from any Jewish roots. Interestingly enough, there also isn't anything that really supports it in the New Testament either. It's an idea that was developed in Christian tradition over the centuries later. Being most famously described in Dante's Inferno.
Which I have a copy of, leather bound.
All right, so then if you continue along, you then get to Islam in the 7th century CE. And Islam had Muhammad studying with some Jews that were in his area. He studied with some Christians in his area. and he came from a Arab pagan background. He combined all three into creating Islam.
Okay.
So there were elements of Judaism that were definitely brought in, including prohibitions on eating pork and shellfish. There were elements of Christianity that were brought in. The list of the prophets take the prophets of Judaism and Christianity. A lot of the stories are taken from the Old Testament. There's some that are taken from the New Testament.
Well, it's easy to pick and choose what you like, right?
And there's still a lot of Arab pagan elements in it, including the most holy site in Islam, in Mecca, is a meteorite that had been a pagan temple. They turned the temple into the most holy site of Islam. And it was just reusing a pagan site that was available. Most of the pagan gods and spirits of the Arab paganism they were all just converted into being various jinns in Islam. More or less equivalent to angels and demons.
Yeah, okay.
It's kind of similar to how Christianity has taken a lot of gods as it has spread and kind of associated them with saints, with one of the best examples being statues in Rome of St. Peter with horns. They just renamed a statue of a Roman god.
Nice. That's lazy.
I think it was Jupiter. And renamed Jupiter to Peter. Doesn't matter that he has horns. It's just like, yeah, that's good enough.
Peter was a Jew, right?
Yeah.
Peter.
That was before that.
Peter.
Oh!
Ba-doom.
But so on the chart, I have lines coming from Judaism and Christianity and coming down from prehistory into Islam. Then next we have in the 8th century CE Shintoism coming up. And that is taking what had been traditional Japanese, proto-religion, if you'd want to call it that, more or less ancestor and emperor worship, and along with borrowing a lot of other elements, including written language from China, the Japanese also borrowed a lot of Buddhism and integrated that in creating Shintoism, which to this day is one of the largest religions in the world, mostly because they claim almost the entire population of Japan as members, even though most of them don't know it.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere you go, there's a Shinto shrine.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody practices it. It's just so ingrained into the cultural identity, there's no separating it.
Yeah.
From the everyday, from any kind of ceremony or major life event or anything. It all just happens there. So,
yeah. But
you don't believe in any of this stuff, but
mm-hmm.
if you're gonna claim, to be have a cultural identity, you're gonna keep doing it.
And if you look at Japanese history, Japan is really good at taking somebody else's idea and making it better. They took Chinese imperial government and they figured out how to make it such that the emperor was a god. Not just like a god, but no, the emperor is God. They figured out how to take Western military and industrialization and completely industrialize their society in a couple of decades, which had taken Europe and the US a couple of centuries to do. And they built in just a couple decades, an army, a military that was able to defeat the Russian Empire. They then were able to take that same thing they had learned from all of that to almost defeat the US and British in World War II after conquering most of China. And then after World War II, they copied modern American manufacturing and figured out how to make American-like cars much better than Americans did.
Yeah. And
they took these American computer systems and figured out how to make electronics and computers better than Americans did.
Yeah, my East Asian cultural teacher, anthropology teacher in college, that was in his, I think the preface to his book was basically that this is one of the reasons why he loves learning about this culture so much, is just to see how they reinvent and make things better.
Yeah.
There's this like drive Just like, okay, how can we improve this?
And that even happened back in the 8th century when Buddhist monks came to Japan, and they're like, okay, how can we take this and our traditional culture, because Japan has always had a very strong tradition and culture based society, still do to this day. They would have taken these innovative ideas that these Buddhist monks would have been bringing over and being like, okay, we can take this element and 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 integrate it into everything and make it an integral part of everybody's day-to-day life without actually requiring it to cut down on anybody's productivity. Win!
Very nice.
Yeah. But so that happened really just within a century or so of Islam developing. And almost a millennium after Buddhism and Judaism. And Zoroastrianism and Jainism. It's Shintoism is a relatively recent thing. So then moving back over towards...
That's so funny, because in Japan it feels so old.
Yeah.
That's funny to me.
Yeah, it's about 1,300 years old.
Well, I mean, that is old.
That is old.
But relative to the rest of the... Like, I've never had a timeline of what all the religions are doing at certain times. Yeah. And that just blows my mind. I thought it was way older than that.
Christianity has been the official religion of Ethiopia longer than Shintoism has been the religion of Japan.
Wow. Yeah, that blows my mind a little. That's awesome.
Yeah. So then if we move back to kind of Persia to Pakistan area, kind of that southwest to South Asia region, we get 15th century with Sikhism, where two friends in what's now Pakistan, one was Hindu. Well, there was a Hindu whose best friend was a Muslim, and he tried to figure out how to get the two to get along by creating a new religion that became Sikhism, combining elements of Islam with elements of Hinduism into this fascinating meshing of the two, with the most iconic part of it being the baptism of the sword as the main rite of passage. And traditionally, Sikhs do not cut their hair, which is why they wear turbans to keep their hair contained. And if you see somebody wearing a turban, it is probably a Sikh.
Yeah.
And traditionally, a Sikh man who has gone through the baptism of the fire will always wear a sword.
You mean baptism of the sword?
Baptism of the sword. Will always wear a sword, and in places where that is not allowable, they have these little ceremonial dagger-like objects they can wear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. That is one that you see it portrayed in popular culture all the time, but I don't know anything about it.
You definitely get it in Bollywood all the time.
Well, yeah.
Not necessarily all the time, but you get it in Bollywood quite a bit. And in modern India, it is not uncommon for Sikhs to do really well in government, despite being the third or maybe even fourth largest religion in India, because they are, and as you'd imagine, if they have a baptism of the sword, they are very prone to enter into the Indian military. And most of your generals in the Indian military are Sikhs.
Okay.
They all take the last name of Singh.
Yeah.
That is something that all Sikhs do. If you do not already have that last name, when you go through the baptism of the sword, you take the last name of Singh. And so General Singh is a very, very common name for high-ranking members of the Indian military. And there have even been Indian presidents and prime ministers who've been Sikhs, not just Hindus. And then the most recent one that makes the list is Baha'i. This is a 19th century innovation. So we're talking 150 years ago, roughly.
Oh, that's a newbie.
Yep. It started in Persia. The Baba was the first guru in Baha'i. He was exiled and eventually executed. His successor, whose name is a lot closer to Baha'i and is where the name of the religion really kind of comes from. He ended up spending a lot of time in exile as well, traveling around between the Ottoman and Persian empires back and forth, depending on who wanted to kill him most. And the concept was about trying to, well, he claimed to be the one that all religions have promised.
My eyes roll.
Yep. He even wrote letters to the courts of Queen Victoria, to the court of Russia, to the courts in Germany, and to Napoleon, and I think at that point it was Napoleon III. Yeah. He sent off a bunch of letters to everybody saying, I'm the one that your religion has promised. I am here. I will teach you how to have world peace by having the one religion for all.
And how well did that go over?
It is, in all practicality, smaller than even smaller than even Jainism.
I've only ever met one, and that was a fluke.
We're still going to try to get him on the show. He's an ex-Baha'i.
Yes.
It's an interesting idea. It is completely descended from and attempts to reform on Islam. And by reform, I mean the guy who was trying to reform it said that he was the solution to all of the problems and everybody needed to follow him.
Right before they all drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah. This one just happened to survive all of that. And is considered an independent religion and not a part of Islam.
Yeah, I can see Islam not wanting anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm. I
always thought that they were based off of more Eastern, like Buddhism or something. Oh, that's Hare Krishna. Never mind.
Hare Krishna is a Hindu sect.
Right. That's not... I got confused for a second.
Yep. I did look up Hare Krishna to see if they belonged on this chart, and they do not. That is just a modern movement within Hinduism, and if I were to include that, I would have to include stuff like Mormonism.
Yeah.
And this chart would just get way too messy.
Oh, dude, is Hare Krishnas, are they the Mormons of Hinduism? Kind of like a subcult?
Maybe.
They have good food, anyway.
Maybe, yeah. We'll eventually get to them. So this is kind of the high-level overview. I do recommend looking at the chart. I know when we were going through kind of Eastern Orthodox history and different relationships, Aaron kept asking for a chart, and I'd never put one together. And with this one, I decided, wait a minute, no, I need to put together a chart. So I made a chart.
It ain't pretty, but it works.
Yeah, it ain't pretty. I tried my best to keep the lines being consistent and not crossing over each other, but I couldn't avoid it to a certain extent. I also got it backwards in one regard because top is early and it moves towards the bottom, which is present. I put the east on the left and I put the west on the right, which is backwards if you look at a map. Platonism should have been on the far left and Shintoism should have been on the far right. So sorry about that, but I did generally try to keep it about as close as I could to being about right, east to west in one direction. What is the most interesting with all of this is all of these religions started where the major innovation was happening. We're talking from the Indus River Valley in India to Persia. That's about 1,000 miles?
Yeah.
That would be about on par with saying, oh yeah, everything that happened that's important in the world happened between Seattle and LA.
That's pretty crazy to think about, but yeah.
All of the
everything else got wiped out.
Mm-hmm. Everything else has been supplanted from these religions that all happened in a very narrow window of the world.
And are all closely related.
And they are all very closely related. And when you consider the fact that Hinduism and Zoroastrianism started so close together and everything else is effectively descended from them, holy crap, that doesn't look that distinct.
Yeah. It just makes me wonder about everything else.
Uh-huh.
All those ones that are gone that we've never even heard of.
Like, could Zoroastrianism to some extent have been a kind of descent from Hinduism? We don't know because that all happened in prehistory, and if that was the case in prehistory, nobody wrote it down later, which sucks.
Which means it doesn't count.
And it doesn't count. Yep. So I hope this very long high-level overview wasn't too confusing. In the next couple dozen off the degrees, we'll be going through the list from adherence.com of the largest religious organizations. So we're not looking at the largest religions, but religious organizations.
Oh, okay.
And as I work through the list...
The largest religions with money.
You
can't have an organization without a lot of money.
Right. Okay, yeah. As we go through the list, though, we will be skipping over quite a few. I will name them and explain why we're skipping over them, and every single case is going to be, we've already talked about this one a lot on the show. Like, we don't need to cover Catholicism.
Mm-hmm. Dead horse, stick. We get the picture.
Yeah. So this will be fun for the next bit. We don't have any feedback, and we don't have any new patrons. So this actually wraps up the episode. Lauren, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
And listeners, remember, not all those who wander are lost. Thank you for listening to another episode of Atheist Nomads. You can find show notes and contact information at atheistnomads.com. Follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/atheistnomads. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcatcher of choice, and while you're there, feel free to leave us a review. Theme music is courtesy of Sturdy Fred. Until next time, this has been the Atheist Nomads.